I hit the riverbank half dead, choking on freezing mud, right at the boots of the worst warlord in the valley. I squeezed my eyes shut. I didn't try to run, and I didn't beg. I couldn't. If I opened my mouth, if I let out even a whisper, the siren blood in my veins would take over. And once the warlords heard what I was, they wouldn't kill me. They'd chain my jaw shut and sell me. I braced for the blade. It didn't come. I heard armor grinding against wet gravel, then hard breathing. When I opened my eyes, the monster everyone warned me about was on his knees in the dirt, pressing his face to the muddy hem of my skirt. Chapter 1. The Alpha's claws dug deep into Aria's scalp, dragging her across the freezing stones of the riverbank. She left a thin smear of blood on the frost-hardened dirt, but kept her mouth shut. Around them, the riverbend pack howled with laughter, their jeers bouncing off the canyon walls. Her crime was simple. She had looked the visiting regional emissary in the eye. A kitchen maid wasn't supposed to look at anyone. Now they were dragging her toward the Whitewater Rapids. A boot caught her in the ribs, sending her sprawling into the mud. She tasted copper and marsh water. Before she could catch her breath, a massive hand knotted into the back of her dress and hoisted her up until her toes barely scraped the ground. The Alpha leaned in close, his breath foul with stale ale and rot, snarled that the ritter would wash the disrespect out of her. Aria didn't make a sound. Silence wasn't just pride, it was survival. If she screamed, her vocal cords would betray the ancient Siren-Wolf cadence buried in her bloodline. A single spoken word from her could override the physical will of any Alpha in the valley. But if they discovered what she was, the warlords wouldn't kill her. They would chain her jaw shut with iron and sell her to the highest bidder as a mind control slave. Drowning in the rapids was a much cleaner fate. The Alpha swung his arm and hurled her off the bank. The wind roared past her ears for a split second before the freezing water swallowed her whole. The river hit her chest like concrete. Air blasted out of her lungs in a frantic cloud of bubbles as the current dragged her under. The water was a dark, spinning meat grinder of pressure and jagged stone. Rocks clipped her shoulders and tore her dress, tossing her until she lost all sense of up and down. There was only the bitter cold and the building fire in her chest. In the dark, she remembered a girl from the Eastern Pack who had possessed a voice like hers. That girl had used it once to stop a drunken Alpha from beating her brother. By dawn, the warlords had descended on their village, bound the girl in rusting iron, and dragged her into the slave markets. She was never seen again. Aria clamped her jaw shut. Her lungs burned for oxygen, and her vision frayed into static. Every survival instinct screamed at her to open her mouth, gasp for air, and command the river and the beasts on the shore to stop. Instead, she locked her teeth together. A violent current slammed her spine against a submerged log. White pain flashed behind her eyes, and her limbs went heavy and numb. The roar of the rapids faded into a dull, distant hum. The water didn't even feel cold anymore. She let the current carry her, drifting like driftwood toward the neutral territories. Gravel scraped against her cheek. Aria coughed, choking up bitter, muddy water as she dragged herself into shallow air. Her body shook with violent tremors. She was lying on her side, half in and half out of the river, her vision blurred by gray stones and dark pines. The river had spat her out somewhere downstream. She tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out. Then came the heavy thud of boots on wet stone. The riverbend hunters had followed the banks to claim her body, or drag her back to the kitchens if she survived. Panic tasted like old copper in her mouth. She tried to scramble backward into the silt. Then the wind shifted. The damp smell of the hunters vanished, swallowed by a sharp, crackling scent of ozone, pine, and fresh blood. Heavy footsteps crunched through the tree line, and the riverbend hunters went dead silent. Aria forced her eyes open. A towering figure stepped onto the gravel, clad in dark, blood-stained armor. It was the commander of the Seven Realms. Just the sight of him sent the riverbend hunters dropping to their knees in the mud, pressing their foreheads to the ground in terror. Aria's heart stopped. She had washed ashore in neutral territory, right at the feet of the most dangerous warlord alive. She closed her eyes, bracing for the blade or the iron chains. Nothing happened. No sword left its scabbard. No orders were barked. A heavy thud of metal hitting gravel echoed over the rushing water. When Aria opened her eyes, the commander was on his knees in the mud before her. His massive chest heaved, his glowing golden eyes fixed on her with a strange, breathless intensity. Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to the ruined hem of her muddy dress. The Alpha slowly turned his head toward the hunters. He didn't yell, and he didn't draw his sword. He didn't even stand up from the mud. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the wet gravel under Aria's hands. "Leave this place," he said. The riverbend men scrambled backward. They abandoned their heavy nets and tracking dogs, running blindly into the dark woods. Aria watched them disappear into the trees, her chest heaving with cold breaths. She noticed a strange silver mark burning on the side of the warlord's neck, glowing faintly in the dim light. She was alone with the most dangerous man alive. She pulled her bleeding knees tightly to her chest, bracing for him to grab her throat or pull heavy iron chains from his cloak. Instead, the warlord reached into his dark, blood-stained mantle and pulled out a thick woolen blanket. He held it out to her. His massive, scarred hands were actually trembling in the cold air. When she looked up at his face, there was no anger in his golden eyes. He looked almost desperate for her to take it. Aria stared at his palm, terrified that accepting the blanket would seal some kind of unspoken contract. Slowly, she reached out her numb blue fingers, snatched the wool, and pulled it over her head. She couldn't figure out what frightened her more, his overwhelming size or his quiet gentleness. Real predators didn't bow to their prey. He stood up to his full height, keeping his huge hands completely visible at his sides. With a single claw, he pointed toward a distant line of gray smoke rising above the pine trees, his war camp. Her body moved on instinct, taking a shaky step forward on bruised feet. With every step he took toward the camp, he stayed exactly 3 paces ahead of her, never crowding her space. As they walked into the neutral territory, she waited for the trap to spring. They walked straight into the center of a sprawling military camp. He didn't cage her or throw her into a damp cell. He led her inside a large command tent and pointed to a soft fur rug near the hearth. The space smelled of crackling pine wood, oiled leather armor, and his own smoky cedar scent. It was warmer and safer than any place she had ever known. Even so, Aria immediately backed herself into the darkest corner of the room. She refused to sit near the bright fire or touch the plate of hot roasted venison on the table. Back at the Riverbend pack, she remembered a young servant girl who had once taken a leftover green apple from the Alpha's plate. The beating that followed lasted 3 days. Knowing the cost of taking what wasn't freely given, she kept her back pressed hard against the canvas wall. Across the room, Cassian sat heavily at a wooden war table. He didn't approach her corner or try to make her speak. Instead, he picked up a stick of black charcoal and began to write on a thick piece of parchment. Aria watched the jerky movements of his hand. He was a famous killer and a brutal conqueror, yet he looked terrified of scaring a soaking wet kitchen maid. He slid the parchment across the smooth wooden floorboards. The paper stopped just inches from her bare toes. She hesitated, her pulse racing in her chest. Trembling, she reached down and picked up the note. The heavy script was easy to read in the firelight. "You are sovereign here. You are safe. Even from me." A strange warmth began to build in her chest. She slowly slid down the canvas wall and sat on the soft fur rug. She didn't fall asleep that night, but she finally stopped shivering. For the next few hours, she just sat there, watching the firelight dance across his scarred face. In the morning, the quiet didn't last. A gray-haired camp healer barged into the tent carrying a rusted metal medical box. The old man didn't ask permission before grabbing Aria's shoulder to inspect the dark purple bruises covering her collarbone. Fear spiked in her chest. After years of enduring brutal violence from older men, she reacted on pure survival instinct. She thrashed against his grip. She kicked over a metal basin of warm water and scrambled backward until her spine hit the wooden table. The angry healer raised a wrinkled hand to strike her face for the disobedience. Before the blow could land, a deafening roar shook the canvas walls. Cassian crossed the room in a blur. He grabbed the old healer by the collar of his tunic. hoisted the grown man off the floor with one arm, and hurled him straight out the tent flap into the mud outside. "Never touch her," his voice thundered. His chest heaved, his sharp claws fully extended from his fingertips, and his golden eyes burned with sudden fury. Aria knew that kind of explosive rage always needed a target. She braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut and waiting for his heavy hand to strike her next. When she finally looked, the warlord had dropped straight to his knees in front of her. He pulled his claws back, hiding them deep within his massive fists so she wouldn't see them. Slowly, he lowered his head, exposing the vulnerable back of his neck to her. It was a posture of absolute submission, offered just to calm her racing heart. He was a ruthless warlord to his men, but right now, he was trying to be a shield for her. The heavy exhaustion of the past 2 days finally caught up with her. Realizing he truly wasn't going to hurt her, she let out a long, shaky breath. She reached out a trembling hand and lightly touched the silver fur resting at the nape of his thick neck. In the quiet that followed, she closed her eyes, leaned against his warm shoulder, and finally fell asleep. When Aria woke up, the tent was empty. The lingering dread that usually greeted her mornings was gone. She wrapped herself in the oversized wool blanket and peeked through the heavy entrance flap to look at the camp. Outside, hundreds of soldiers moved through morning drills in the freezing mud. Cassian stood at the center of the training yard, sparring with 3 men at once. He blocked their strikes smoothly, keeping his movements measured. When a young soldier misjudged his footing and left his flank wide open, Aria flinched. She expected a brutal correction, the kind of casual violence alpha leaders use to discipline clumsy subordinates. But Cassian just lowered his practice blade, tapped the boy's ankle with his boot to correct the stance, and murmured something that made the young recruit smile sheepishly. Aria watched him from the shadows of the canvas. The brutal conqueror of legend didn't match the man standing patiently in the mud. A sudden breeze carried her scent across the yard. Cassian froze mid-stride. The silver mark on his neck pulsed with a faint warm glow. He looked straight toward her hiding spot at the tent flap and gave a single slow nod, a simple acknowledgement that she was safe to exist there. Before she could step outside, a warning horn echoed across the valley. A mounted messenger bearing the dark green banner of the Riverbend Pack rode through the perimeter gates. Aria retreated behind a wooden folding screen in the corner of the tent, pressing both hands over her mouth to muffle her breathing. A few yards away, Cassian stood at the war table, surrounded by his commanders. The Riverbend messenger had just delivered his alpha's terms. Return the mute kitchen maid immediately, or face retaliation. "We must give the girl back," the oldest general argued, his voice tight with anxiety. "We cannot risk a border war over a broken servant." Aria squeezed her eyes shut. She had been treated as disposable her entire life. It made painful, logical sense for Cassian to hand over the chains and avoid losing his men over a maid. She waited for the inevitable betrayal. Cassian brought both fists down onto the table. The heavy timber groaned under the impact, sending parchment rolls scattering across the floor. "She is not a servant," he growled, his voice dropping into a heavy alpha timbre that silenced the room instantly. "She is under my protection. If they want her, they will have to wade through my blood to take her." No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever claimed her life was worth fighting for. Hot tears spilled onto her cheeks. She stepped out from behind the screen without a word. The generals instinctively reached for their hilts, but she ignored them, walking straight toward Cassian. The rage on his face melted the second he looked at her. She reached out and placed her small hand over his scarred fist. It was a quiet statement to the entire room. She wasn't hiding anymore. That night, the camp held an uneasy feast around the bonfires. Aria sat near the edge of the light, while Cassian kept his distance a few feet away, deliberately giving her breathing room. The soldiers drank berry wine and ate roasted pork, but their eyes stayed fixed on the dark tree line. The threat of Riverbend hung over the camp. A young servant boy walked up to Aria with a silver goblet of water. As she reached for it, she caught the sickly sweet smell of crushed nightshade rolling off his clothes, a deadly paralytic poison hunters use to incapacitate rogue wolves. Before she could pull back, the boy dropped the cup, pulled a curved dagger from his sleeve, and lunged for her throat. Cassian hit the assassin before the blade could connect. He slammed the boy into the dirt, wrestled the knife away, and pinned his arms with terrifying speed. With a feral snarl, Cassian drove his heavy fist into the earth just an inch from the traitor's ear, burying his knuckles deep into the wet gravel to stop himself from crushing the boy's skull. Guards rushed in immediately, dragging the weeping assassin away into the shadows. Aria sat frozen in the mud, her pulse racing. Cassian slowly pushed himself to his feet, his hands coated in dirt and blood. His chest heaved as he stared down at his knuckles. He refused to look at her, clearly convinced that his sudden burst of violence had just terrified her and proved he was the monster everyone claimed he was. She didn't run. She left the safety of her corner and crawled through the cold mud toward him. Aria dragged herself through the cold, sticky mud on bare knees, ignoring the hundreds of soldiers watching from the edges of the yard. She reached out and wrapped her fingers around Cassian's wrist. He flinched, his golden eyes dropping to her hand. Red blood from his battered knuckles had smeared against her pale skin. He stared at it, his breathing shallow, horrified by the evidence of his own violence. She squeezed his wrist tighter to anchor him, a quiet proof that she wasn't frightened by what he had done to save her. They walked in silence to the interrogation tent. 2 guards dragged the weeping assassin inside, while Cassian followed, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Aria slipped inside behind him, staying back in the shadows near the entrance, where the air smelled of rust, stale sweat, and fear. Cassian stood over the bound boy, keeping his massive hands locked firmly behind his back. His voice stayed low and level, even when the boy spat a mouthful of blood onto his chest plate. He didn't strike back. He just absorbed the insult, his gaze flicking toward the shadows where Aria hid. He was holding back his alpha instincts to keep from scaring her, compromising his effectiveness as a commander just to keep her feeling safe. She remembered her father keeping his hands at his sides while a local landlord beat him. That choice was meant to protect his family from worse punishment, but it ultimately cost him his life. Seeing Cassian stand there taking the abuse, she realized her presence in the tent was making him vulnerable. She stepped out of the shadows, walked up to him, and pulled gently on his cloak to lead him outside. The tension drained out of Cassian's shoulders the second the command tent flap closed behind them. He went straight to the wooden basin and began washing the dried blood from his knuckles. Aria watched from the fur rug. His chest was covered in old, faded scars, yet he handled the washcloth with slow, deliberate care. She stood up and walked to the war table. She picked up the piece of black charcoal he had used to write her that first letter, pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her, and pressed the charcoal to the paper. She drew a clean line, then a curve, 4 letters. She turned around. Cassian was already watching her, the dripping washcloth forgotten in his hand. She held up the parchment so the hearthlight caught the dark script, Aria. Cassian dropped the cloth and crossed the room in 2 strides. He stopped inches away, staring down at the paper before reaching out to trace the letters with the tip of one claw. Aria, he whispered. His rumbling voice vibrated through the floorboards. She stepped forward and rested her forehead against the center of his chest. That night, the hooves of returning scout horses woke her from a deep sleep. Cassian was already standing by the tent flap, fully dressed in his heavy armor. As he stepped outside into the gathering wind to meet his generals, Aria crept to the canvas wall and pressed her ear against the fabric. A scout was speaking in a ragged, breathless voice. The Riverbend pack had not retreated. Instead, they had formed a coalition with 3 rogue packs from the western valleys. Hundreds of wolves were marching toward the border. Cassian's voice remained flat and calm. He issued rapid orders to fortify the eastern ridge and prepare for a siege, instructing his officers to keep the enemy's true numbers secret from the rest of the camp, and from her. When he ordered the men back to their posts, Aria scrambled back to the hearth, pretending she had just woken up. On the floorboards nearby lay a crumpled piece of parchment that had fallen from the scout's bag. She snatched it up and unfolded the dirty map. It detailed the enemy's marching route, but the scrawl at the bottom made her freeze. Capture the mute maid alive. Bring us the Siren-Wolf. A cold wave of dread hit her chest. They knew what she was. This wasn't a border dispute over territory, it was a hunting party. They were coming to put iron on her jaw and sell her voice to the highest bidder. She stared blankly at the canvas wall, realizing Cassian was about to march his army into a slaughter just to protect her secret. Aria looked down at the crumpled map in the firelight. As long as she stayed at the camp, Cassian's men were targets. She remembered a story her mother used to tell about a lone wolf that drew a pack of starving bears away from its den. The wolf didn't survive, but the pups lived to see the spring. Aria knew she had to be the decoy tonight. She grabbed a small leather satchel from the corner, stuffing a hard loaf of bread and a thin wool blanket inside. Moving quietly, she slipped through the heavy canvas entrance flap. The midnight air hit her bare face. The military camp was silent, and thick white snow had started falling over the pines. She kept low, skirting past the night guards toward the perimeter. Her bare toes went numb in the powder by the time she reached the tree line. Before she could take another step into the dark, a shadow detached itself from the falling snow, blocking her path completely. Cassian stood in the moonlight without his heavy battle armor. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his golden eyes wide and frantic. Instead of grabbing her or yelling, he dropped to his knees in the deep snow right at her feet. He looked down at the frozen ground, his hands shaking at his sides. "I've killed too many people to count," Cassian whispered, his voice cracking. "I built this empire by being worse than the men who hunted me. If you walk into those woods tonight, there is nothing left to keep me human." Aria looked down at him. Leaving him wouldn't save him or his men. She remembered an old alpha back at Riverbend who had lost his mate to a winter fever. He had completely deteriorated into a mindless feral beast within a month. Without an anchor, Cassian would do the exact same thing. He wasn't acting like a conqueror or a king. He was just a terrified man, terrified of being left alone in the dark. She dropped her satchel into the powder and sank to her knees in the freezing snow. Reaching out, she wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him into an embrace. They stumbled back into the sanctuary of the command tent, the heavy canvas flap falling shut to seal out the wind. Cassian picked her up and carried her straight to the thick fur rug beside the hearth. The tent was warm, smelling of cedar wood, burning pine, and smoke. Aria reached up and traced the old, faded scars crossing his chest. He let out a low rumble that vibrated against her fingers. His golden eyes searched her face closely, looking for hesitation. There was none. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her neck, right over her pulse. She pulled his face toward hers and kissed him back. When they parted, she didn't pull away. She opened her mouth and forced air through her unused throat. The tight muscles burned, resisting the movement after years of silence. "Cassian," she whispered. The sound was hoarse and broken, but clear. Cassian went completely still. His chest hitched, and he pulled her impossibly close, burying his face in the curve of her shoulder as his breathing turned ragged. Outside, the harsh blast of a warning horn cut through the wind. The war horn sounded again, a jagged note that vibrated through the canvas walls. Cassian was off the rug instantly. He didn't look back as he strapped on his chest piece, the metal buckles snapping together. In seconds, his posture shifted from the man on the hearth to a military commander. "Stay here," he said, his voice dropping into a rough growl. He pushed through the tent flap into the dark. Aria got to her feet and hurried to the opening to look outside. The camp was in chaos. Archers were firing volleys into the falling snow toward the eastern perimeter, where Cassian's guard was sprinting to meet the attack. A group of cloaked figures from the Riverbend pack were moving quietly along the back edge of the camp, staying out of the firelight. They weren't heading toward the fighting on the ridge. They were coming straight toward the command tent. The frontal assault was a diversion. Behind her, the canvas wall ripped open with the sharp sound of tearing fabric. 3 men stepped into the hearthlight. Their eyes carried the sickly yellow glow of feral wolves. Aria backed away, her hands searching the table for a weapon, a knife, a log, a heavy kettle, as the air in the room grew cold and thick. The lead infiltrator gestured to his men. Aria swung a heavy iron stool at the nearest soldier, but he caught one of the legs in his bare hand and shoved it aside with enough force to send her sprawling across the floorboards. His fingers closed around her throat. She clawed at his wrist, her nails scraping across rough skin. but his grip only tightened until her lungs burned and her vision frayed. They pinned her face down onto the rug. The smell of damp sheepskin and mud filled her nose. A second man knelt beside her holding heavy, rusted iron shackles, carved with jagged runes that pulsed a dull green. They were siren-suppressing manacles, forged specifically to burn out her vocal cords and strip her of her voice. She tried to cry out, but the pressure on her windpipe choked the sound into a raspy wheeze. The metal clicked shut around her neck. A spike of searing heat shot through her throat. She arched her back, her mouth open in a silent scream as the runes burned into her flesh. They dragged her by her arms toward the torn canvas at the back of the tent. Outside, fires were spreading through the supply lines. Across the yard, she saw Cassian's sister being pushed along by another group of raiders. Cassian was nowhere in sight, cut off by the archers along the ridge. The riverbend men pulled her into the dark, frozen trees. With every step she took, the burning iron around her throat grew hotter. Up on the rocky outcrop overlooking the canyon, the wind was numbingly cold. Below them, the fighting continued, but from the ridge it looked distant and small. The lead raider forced her to her knees in the dirt. His hand twisted into her hair to yank her head back. Down on the canyon floor stood Cassian. He was entirely alone in the mud, surrounded by enemy soldiers. His heavy sword lay discarded a few paces away. He had walked right into the trap, dropping his weapons to buy time the second he saw them holding his sister and Aria on the ridge. Aria stared at the rusted metal collar locked around her neck. Smoldering ash flaked off the runes, the iron draining her strength and leaving her throat raw and swollen. She couldn't speak. She could barely breathe without tasting copper and smoke. She looked down at Cassian. He raised his head, his golden eyes finding hers across the distance. He wasn't watching the soldiers raising their spears around him. He was looking only at her. She had spent her entire life locking her teeth together so she wouldn't draw attention or cause destruction. But looking at Cassian unarmed in the mud, she understood what that silence had actually bought her. Nothing. She stopped fighting the pain in her throat and focused on the physical weight of the collar. Her voice was bound, but her hands were free. She wedged her raw, bleeding fingers underneath the burning iron, digging into the skin of her own neck as she braced herself to pull the metal apart. The winter air tasted of copper and ash. Aria wedged her bleeding fingernails beneath the iron shackles locked around her throat. The runes sparked against her skin, sending jolts of searing heat down her neck. Her muscles shook with the effort, urging her to drop her hands and collapse into the snow, but she kept her gaze fixed on the canyon floor below. Cassian stood alone in the mud, surrounded by soldiers with daggers drawn. He wasn't raising a hand to defend himself. He was going to let them butcher him right there in the dirt, just to buy her and his sister a few extra seconds of life. Seeing him waiting for the blade, the realization finally hit her. Her silence hadn't protected anyone. It had simply given these men the room to take whatever they wanted. With a low, ragged snarl, she yanked her hands upward with everything she had left. The rusted iron cracked. A sharp edge of metal sliced across her palm, dripping blood onto the white powder. But she didn't stop. She pulled harder, using the pain to fuel her grip. The iron snapped open with a sharp ringing crack, releasing a pulse of force that blew the falling snow outward in a wide circle. With the iron collar cast aside, the air around her smelled sharply of ozone. Aria stumbled to her feet, her balance precarious on the rocky edge of the cliff. She clutched her bleeding throat, dragging cold air into lungs that finally felt open. Down in the canyon, the riverbend alpha let out a harsh laugh and raised his broadsword to finish Cassian. She had to break their lines before that swing landed. She raised her chin, locking her eyes onto the chaos below, and stopped fighting the ancient cadence buried in her blood. The air went completely still. The howling wind died to a hush. Even the fighting soldiers paused, glancing up toward the cliffside as a strange atmospheric pressure descended over the valley floor. Cassian looked up from the mud. Their eyes met across the distance. He didn't look frightened of what she was. He just watched her with steady devotion, silently accepting whatever she was about to unleash. She walked to the very edge of the precipice, her boots crunching in the frozen dirt, and parted her swollen lips. Down in the mud, the Riverbend Alpha swung his broadsword toward Cassian's neck. Aria opened her mouth wide, drawing in a deep, cold breath as she prepared to release her voice for the first time in her life. Cassian didn't wait for the rescue. He surged upward from the mud, catching the descending steel in his gauntleted hand, and shattering the blade with a violent twist of his wrist. Realizing what was happening on the ridge, a squad of enemy guards scrambled up the embankment toward Aria, desperate to cut her down before she could make a sound. Heavy footsteps pounded against the stone behind her, closing in fast. She didn't turn around to face them. She kept her eyes on the valley floor, held her ground on the ledge, and let the air rush up from her chest. Aria let the breath out. It wasn't a standard scream. It was a dense, sonic pressure that hit the canyon floor like a physical blow. The air warped around her as the Siren-Wolf cadence slammed into the rock walls. She had spent a lifetime terrified that her own voice would tear her apart from the inside out. Instead, letting it go just left her lungs feeling clean. Down in the mud, the line broke. The Riverbend Alpha hit the dirt first, his knees buckling under the sheer force of the cadence. All around him, the rebel fighters dropped their swords, their muscles locking up as the magic overrode their will. The entire front line collapsed into the snow. Cassian and his guard moved through the frozen ranks without friction. He grabbed his sister from her captors, secured the rebel leaders, and stripped their weapons without having to swing his blade once. As the sound faded into the winter sky, the toll of the scream caught up with her. The warmth drained out of her arms and legs, the trees blurred into gray static, and her knees folded beneath her. Cassian reached the ledge before she hit the dirt. He discarded his weapons in the snow and caught her, pulling her weight against his chest as he dropped to his knees. "Aria," he said. His voice was cracked, barely above a rasp. His fingers hovered over the bleeding cuts on her neck where the iron had bitten in. He looked frantic, his breathing shallow as he searched her face, clearly convinced the scream had permanently destroyed her throat. She reached up and pressed her palm against his jaw to stop his shaking. She forced her throat to work. The muscles felt raw and scraped, but she drew the air in anyway. "I command you," she whispered, the words rough but distinct, "to hold me." Cassian exhaled sharply, his shoulders dropping as the tension finally left him. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck, while the snow fell around them. By spring, the war camps were disassembled. Aria stood on the stone dais of the new capital overlooking the valley. She wore a formal gown of crimson and gold, with a thin silver circlet set in her hair. She left her neck completely uncovered, letting the bright sunlight catch the jagged, silver scar left by the iron collar. In the courtyard below, the surviving pack leaders from across the territories knelt on the stone. It wasn't the forced submission of a conquered enemy. It was an oath of allegiance. By choosing to disarm the coalition rather than slaughtering them in the mud, she had established a different kind of law, one built on mediation rather than fear. She glanced to her left. Cassian stood beside her, watching the courtyard. The heavy posture of the warlord was gone, replaced by the quiet focus of a guardian. When he turned his golden eyes toward her, the guilt that had haunted him for years was nowhere to be found. She reached out and took his hand, weaving her fingers through his. Standing before the crowd, she looked out over the valley, breathing in the quiet air without holding anything back.